The first time I met Meredith Griffith, she looked at my hands. Not my face, not the way I'd dressed for the occasion, not even Michael standing beside me with his hand on the small of my back. She looked at my hands the way I'd learned to look at a patient's gait cataloging before committing to a conclusion. We were standing in the foyer of the house in Belle Mead, the one with the magnolia that scraped the second-floor gutters, and she said, "You must be the one he's been hiding from us," and smiled like that was a warmth rather than an opening move. I was 31. I'd been a licensed occupational therapist for 6 years. I knew how to read a room. Michael's hand pressed once at my spine, brief, apologetic, a pressure he had probably not consciously intended. Maxwell, his father, came through from the kitchen carrying a dish towel and saved the moment by shaking my hand with both of his and saying he'd heard good things. That was the whole of Maxwell's welcome, and it was more than enough. Meredith ran the orientation program at a private school in Green Hills for 22 years. She was used to sizing up families. She was used to being right. We married the following spring. Michael worked for a commercial construction firm out on Charlotte Pike, project management, the kind of work that required him to hold a dozen variables in his head simultaneously and still read a blueprint in deteriorating light. He was good at his job the way competent people are, quietly, without ceremony. What he was less good at was his mother, but I did not understand the depth of that until after Nora was born. Nora arrived in late October, 3 years into the marriage. She had Michael's coloring, his particular shade of dark hair, the gray-green eyes that ran on his father's side, but her cheekbones were mine, and her widow's peak, and the slight asymmetry in her left eyebrow that I'd inherited from my father and never thought about until Meredith noticed it. She noticed it at Nora's 4-month visit, standing in our kitchen on Fatherland Street in East Nashville, holding Nora against her shoulder with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this before. "She doesn't look much like you, Michael," she said, without looking up from Nora's face. The comment passed through the room and settled into the grout between the tiles, and Michael said, "She has my eyes, Mom," and that was that. Except it wasn't. I started writing things down around the 6-month mark. Not because I was afraid of losing track. I have a good memory, clinical training sharpens it, but because documentation is what I do when a pattern needs to become visible. I kept a notes file on my work iPad, time-stamped, dry, April 7, Belle Mead dinner. "Meredith, those cheekbones are unusual. Where does that come from?" Directed at table, not at me. Michael did not respond. I had notes going back 8 months, before I understood what I was building a case against. The comments were never loud. That was the part that made them difficult to name. Meredith was not a shouting woman. She was a woman who had spent 2 decades assessing whether families deserved the resources she allocated, and she had learned that insinuation, delivered calmly, did more lasting work than accusation. "She's so different from you and Michael both. Does she look like someone from your side, Michelle? It's funny how genetics work. Sometimes you see a child and you'd never know." Molly, Michael's younger sister, occasionally echoed the notes without seeming to know the score she was reading from. Molly lived in Brentwood and had her mother's talent for repeating a thing as though she'd thought of it herself. I told Michael once in bed, lights off, carefully. I said, "I think your mother is implying something." He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "She does that. She doesn't mean it." I didn't push it. I understood by then that Michael's coping mechanism was the long way around, and I loved him enough to let him take it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was at Vanderbilt Stallworth, between sessions, eating a granola bar in the hallway outside the neurology rehabilitation wing. I had a 64-year-old stroke patient whose return of fine motor function was outpacing his emotional processing, and we were navigating that gap carefully. My phone showed an unknown number with a 615 area code, and I answered out of the habit of a person whose patients sometimes call from borrowed phones. The woman identified herself as a patient services coordinator at a genetics laboratory in Maryland. She was calling, she said, as a courtesy, because the credit card associated with a pediatric DNA profile they'd received had been flagged for an address discrepancy, and their policy required verbal confirmation from a legal guardian before processing. The sample had been submitted as part of a paternity and lineage panel. The name on the pediatric profile was Nora Griffith. Date of birth, Nora's date of birth. She was sorry if she'd caught me at a bad time. I stood in the hallway and breathed. Across from me, a man in his 80s was learning, again, how to hold a fork. I told the coordinator to note my verbal confirmation and said I'd follow up in writing. I thanked her. I ended the call. I stood there for another 30 seconds, looking at the linoleum, and then I went back into my patient. Mia Perry had an office on 2nd Avenue in Germantown, above a coffee roaster that kept the stairwell smelling like dark roast all morning. She'd done the Griffiths' house closing 2 years prior, and she remembered Michael. I told her the situation without editorializing, the way I presented a patient history, and she listened without writing anything down. When I finished, she said, "Have you told your husband?" I said I hadn't yet. She looked at me for a moment. "The test has been submitted," she said. "Results will come back regardless. You could seek an injunction, but these labs work fast and you'd be in court the same week she plans to use the results." She paused. "Or you could let it run." She said it the way experienced people say the thing that sounds counterintuitive but isn't. If the results say what she wants them to say, you've got a problem. If they say what you know they'll say, you've got something else. She didn't say what that something else was. She didn't need to. I drove home on Gallatin Pike in the gray afternoon, past the corner where the laundromat used to be before it became a cocktail bar. And I thought about my notes file and my patient who was learning to hold a fork. I did not tell Michael, not yet. The laboratory result arrived in my email. Mia had requested a courtesy copy for the Guardian on file 11 days before the April dinner. I opened it at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning while Nora slept and Michael's coffee finished brewing. The paternity panel was on the first page. Michael was Nora's father. I had known this. I had needed to see it in that particular typeface, those particular numbers, to carry what I was about to carry, and now I had. I turned to the second page because there was a second page. A lineage and ancestry component included as part of the extended panel Meredith had ordered. She had been thorough. I gave her that. The secondary findings included a first-degree familial match outside the submitted family unit. The matched profile was in the laboratory's database, a voluntary registrant. The name was Micah Brown. The estimated relationship was half-sibling to the paternal contributor. I sat with that for a long time. I refilled my coffee. The morning light came through the Fatherland Street windows at the angle it always did in April, laying itself across the kitchen floor. Michael had no siblings except Molly. Maxwell, I happen to know, had 2 brothers and no sisters. Which left Meredith. I did not need the calculator. Micah Brown was estimated, by the same laboratory Meredith had hired, to be approximately 33 years old. Meredith and Maxwell had married 31 years ago. She held the dinner at Belmead on a Saturday. Maxwell had smoked a pork shoulder. Molly came with her husband and their 2 kids. Aunt Mee, Meredith's older sister from Murfreesboro, sat at the end of the table closest to the kitchen. She always sat there, I'd noticed, a positioning that allowed easy exit. That detail had not meant anything to me before. It did now. Nora sat in a booster at the corner between me and Michael, eating her roll in pieces she tore with both hands, narrating her meal to herself in a low, continuous murmur that I loved unreasonably. She was 2.5. She smelled like sunscreen and the cotton of her shirt. Meredith had set the table formally. That was the first thing I noticed when we arrived, the good china, cloth napkins, candles, a performance of occasion. Maxwell served from the kitchen. Molly's children asked to be excused after the first course and were redirected. The conversation moved in its usual channels. Michael's current project out in Antioch, Molly's renovation, the weather, a neighbor's illness. Meredith waited until the plates were nearly cleared. Then she rose, briefly, went to the sideboard, and returned with an envelope. She set it on the table. Not in front of me, not in front of Michael, at the center, equidistant, like a document being entered into evidence. "I want to be honest with this family," she said. Her voice was the voice she used for difficult conversations with parents of struggling children, composed, regretful, resolute. "I've had concerns for some time. About Nora. About what I've observed." She did not look at me. "I arranged to have a test done. A DNA panel. I know that wasn't my place, but I needed to know the truth, and I believe this family deserves to know it. Maxwell had stopped eating. Molly was very still. Michael said, "Mom," a single syllable, flat and quiet. "The results confirm," she said, "that Michael is Nora's father." A pause that was supposed to feel like disappointment, conceded rather than defeat. I want to acknowledge that I was wrong to doubt. But the secondary findings. "There are secondary findings," I said. The table turned toward me. I reached into my bag, which was on the floor beside my chair, and I placed my own copy of the report on the table. I had paperclipped the second page to the top. "The laboratory's extended panel identified a first-degree familial match," I said. "A half-sibling to Michael on his paternal contributor's side. His paternal contributor is Maxwell. I let that locate itself in the room. The matched individual is 33 years old. His name is Micah Brown. He lives in Raleigh. He's been registered in that database for 2 years." The room was very quiet. Nora had stopped murmuring to herself and was watching the adults with the alert, unsentimental curiosity of a small child who senses weather without knowing its name. I did not look at Meredith for a moment. When I did, she had gone very still in the particular way that means someone has understood something faster than they wanted to. Aunt Mee's hand was flat on the tablecloth, not reaching for anything, just flat as though bracing. "Maxwell said, Meredith, just her name. He said it the way someone says a word they have trusted for 30 years and are now weighing for the first time." The drive home was through the April dark, past the lights along Hillsborough Pike, and then down into the quieter streets toward East Nashville. Nora fell asleep in her car seat 11 minutes in. I counted because I needed to count something. Her hands were open in her lap. Michael drove. He was a careful driver always, and he drove with the same quality that night: steady hands, appropriate speed. After a while he said, "How long have you known?" I told him. The phone call, Mia Perry, the email, the 11 days. I told him plainly and without apology because he deserved the plain version. He was quiet for a long stretch of Shelby Avenue. "You could have told me," he said, and then, before I could speak, "I know why you didn't." He exhaled. "I know exactly why you didn't." I looked at the streetlights, going over us one at a time. "I found Micah Brown's email through the lab's contact permission," I said. "He consented to contact. I haven't done anything with it." A pause. "That part is yours to decide." He didn't say anything. I didn't need him to. I watched the lights. The weeks that followed moved in the way aftermath moves, not in a line but in layers. Molly called on a Wednesday, 10 days after the dinner, and her apology ran almost 8 minutes long. It was specific in a way I had not expected. She named individual comments, individual dinners, the way she had repeated her mother's insinuations without examining them. I sat in my car in the Stallworth parking lot and listened all the way through, and when she finished I said, "Thank you." That was real, and I meant it. Maxwell drove to the Fatherland Street house on a Thursday evening, unannounced, while Michael was putting Nora to bed. I opened the door and he stood there in his work jacket, hands in his pockets, and said, "I didn't know. I need you to understand that I didn't know." His voice was an instrument not designed for this kind of use, and he was using it anyway. I told him I believed him. I made him coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, and didn't say much for a while, and that seemed to be what was needed. Michael emailed Micah Brown on a Sunday morning. He wrote it at the table, and I was present but not reading over his shoulder. I was doing my documentation from the week, old habit. He sent it and put the phone face down and went out to the garden. 3 days later, Micah wrote back. Michael came and found me in the back bedroom that served as my home office and stood in the doorway and read the email to me, beginning to end. Micah Brown was a structural engineer. He had grown up in Raleigh with adoptive parents who had told him early and clearly what he was. He had spent 4 years looking. His email was careful and careful and careful, and at the end of it something opened. Meredith came on a Thursday afternoon in May, 6 weeks after the dinner. Michael was at a site meeting in Antioch. Nora was at daycare on Eastland. I was home between clients, eating lunch, and I heard the car on the street before I heard the doorbell. She looked smaller than she had at the dinner. I don't know how else to describe it. She had worn her school administrator face for so long that its absence left something exposed and insufficient, and I found that I did not want to lean into that. I let her in and did not offer coffee. We stood in the living room. She said she was sorry. She said it several times in several forms, the way someone will when they are not sure which form will be accepted, and I waited until she finished. I want to tell you what I need, I said. Not what I want, what I need going forward to be in a room with you. I had thought about this in the way I thought about treatment plans. What is the measurable goal? What is the realistic timeline? I need the comments to stop. Permanently. I need you to understand that Nora will know, when she is old enough, what you did, and I will not protect you from that knowledge reaching her. And I need you to understand that your relationship with her, and with us, depends entirely on whether your behavior changes, not on whether you apologize. She was crying by then. I had expected that, and I tried to let it mean what it meant without letting it do more work than it was entitled to do. I said, I don't know what your history cost you or what it felt like to carry it that long. I'm not asking you to tell me. A pause. But I'm not going to pretend that what you did to this family was caused by something I can't see. You made choices. They had consequences. That's where we are. She left 20 minutes later. The magnolia scent from a neighbor's yard had come into the doorway while we were talking and stayed. I went back to the kitchen. I finished my lunch. I wrote up a session note from the morning and submitted it to the EMR before my next client. By August, Michael had driven to Raleigh twice. The second time he took Nora, and she fell asleep against his arm in a restaurant on Glenwood Avenue while Michael and Micah talked across her head for 3 hours. Michael told me about it when he got home, sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing his driving clothes. He looks like Dad around the eyes, he said. Not anywhere else, just there. I was already in bed with a book I wasn't reading. I turned off my lamp. The house on Fatherland Street had the particular quiet of late summer, the cicadas doing their diminishing work in the dark outside. Nora was asleep down the hall with her arms over her head the way she always slept, surrendered, entirely herself. I thought about my patient from the spring, the one learning to hold a fork. He could hold one now. He would not hold it the way he had before the stroke. That exact motion was gone, a particular neural pathway closed for good. But he had built a different path, careful and slow and finally sufficient, and last week he had eaten his lunch sitting across from his wife, and neither of them had commented on it, and that had seemed to me like the right kind of ending. I lay in the dark beside my husband and listened to the house settle.